Before we begin today's topic of discussion, I would like to make a quick announcement. I have opened up a Telegram channel, the link to which will be in the video description. If you enjoy my content on YouTube or on Rumble, please be sure to visit my Telegram channel as well. It gives me an easy way to notify everybody whenever I make a new video, and it also contains some miscellaneous posts in the form of texts, which pertain to various events that are happening in Ukraine. Telegram is a completely free platform. There is absolutely no censorship there, so I am able to post all kinds of content on Telegram. So once again, if you enjoy my videos, please be sure to check out my Telegram channel as well. The link will be in the video description. And now moving on to today's topic of discussion. I would like to discuss the global geopolitical effects that this war between Russia and Ukraine has had and is going to have potentially in the future. And this is going to be a direct continuation of one of my previous videos, in which I explained that contrary to the narratives of mainstream propaganda, Ukraine has zero chance of actually militarily winning this war in the long term. And what I meant by that is that sooner or later, Ukraine is going to have to admit to a military defeat, and that at the very least, it is going to have to make some very serious concessions, including territorial concessions. Of course, all of that is assuming that a single Ukraine, or even the present Ukrainian government, even exists at that point. And now, in this video, I would like to continue on with that topic, but to discuss it at a slightly broader and larger scope. That is to say, to not only discuss the war itself from a military perspective, but all of the long-term geopolitical consequences that might arise from this war. And perhaps the first thing that needs to be said here is that we have no real way of knowing exactly how the war will end. As of right now, all of the evidence suggests that fighting on the ground will continue for, at the very least, a few months. And until that time, there are hundreds of different force majeures that can potentially happen, all of which will, of course, change the outcome of the war. So perhaps this video isn't going to be focused too much on trying to predict the future, but rather on analyzing what we are seeing thus far. And what we are seeing is not just a geopolitical battle between Ukraine and Russia. It is not even a geopolitical battle between the collective West and Russia. But rather, I would argue that what we are seeing now is a geopolitical battle between the collective West and the collective East. And this is where we have to realize the fact that China and Russia are very close de facto allies. And that while these two countries form the bulkhead of the alliance, they are by no means its only members. The post-Soviet countries of Central Asia are heavily integrated with Russia, whereas Pakistan, a country of over 200 million people and a nuclear power, is closely integrated with China. Together with India and Iran, which are also becoming heavily integrated from both an economic and a political perspective into this organization that includes China and Russia. We get the expanding alliance, which for now I will simply refer to as the collective East. The countries that I have listed up until now are all part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which, it should be noted, is not the alliance itself, since the Shanghai Cooperation Organization does not include any military obligations. It does not include any significant economic or political integration of its member states, like, for example, the European Union does. But nonetheless, it is unmistakable that all of its member states are becoming closely integrated with one another, and that they are forming a de facto alliance. And perhaps most importantly, all of them have the same global interests, which, most notably, align in creating a global framework which can be an alternative to the Western political, economic, and military hegemony. Or better yet, to simply overthrow that hegemony and leave it behind in the dust. And here it should be noted that this de facto alliance is not merely limited to the countries of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Various countries throughout Africa, throughout North America and South America, as well as a few European countries, namely Belarus and perhaps also Serbia, are all, to one extent or another, friendly and integrated with the countries that I call the Global East. And while the countries of the Global East may not be overtly supporting Russia, like the Global West supports Ukraine, the support is nonetheless there, and more importantly, the interest in weakening the opponent, that is to say the Global West, is certainly there. And that is why, out of all of the countries that I have mentioned so far, none have done anything to either dissuade or condemn Russia from its military operation. On the contrary, all of these countries are interested in seeing a Western-controlled puppet state be destroyed, and to see the Western military alliance, NATO, be discredited in having the country into which they poured so many military resources now be militarily defeated and be politically absorbed away from the Global West and into the Global East. And of course, there is also another very important dimension to this global geopolitical war, and that is the economy. Sanctions and hostile economic policies are flying left, right, and center, and the goal for both sides is clearly to cripple the economy of the other side. And then you also have the general military buildup that is happening in the collective West. You have, for example, Germany increasing its military budget to 100 billion euros a year. But that is something that we are simply not going to have enough time to talk about in any detail in this video. So I will be discussing that separately and at a later point. But going back to the war in Ukraine, a win for the collective West, a geopolitical win that is, would be a situation where Ukraine is destroyed, but in that process, the Russian military sustains very high losses, is bogged down in Ukraine for an extended period of time, and the Russian economy takes a big hit from which it doesn't recover anytime soon. On the other hand, the conditions for victory for the Global East would be a situation where the Ukrainian military is destroyed without considerable casualties or losses from the Russian side, as well as a situation in the global economy where the combined economies of the collective West take a much larger hit than the Russian economy or the economies of other countries within the Global East. And here we have to note two small details. The first one concerns the economy, and that is that even in a situation where Russia's economy suffers a bigger hit than the combined economies of the collective West, or even just the economy of the European Union, that situation would result in a greater overall loss for the collective West than for the collective East. And that is simply because, in terms of only the economy, Russia just isn't as big of a player as the United States or the European Union. So to put it bluntly, losing 40% of 20 is not as bad as losing 20% of 100. And a little side note that I would make here is that the Russian economy is by no means a small economy. It is much larger than what mainstream Western propaganda would have you believe. However, nonetheless, it is still, relatively speaking, and in absolute terms as well, smaller than the combined economies of the European Union, the Chinese economy, or the economy of the United States. That much goes without question. And the other point that I would make is concerning the military situation. We are now seeing major shipments of all sorts of weapons to Ukraine. Most of these are older weapons, and after being shipped to Ukraine, most of them are going to be replaced by newer weapons that the military-industrial complex is going to manufacture. However, over the last several days and weeks, we have seen various Western countries openly say that they do not have any more weapons that they can spare for Ukraine. And here, both the Baltic states and Germany come to mind. And this comes at a time when Ukraine is increasingly begging for all sorts of weapon systems that the West can spare. And as indications show, most of the military that Ukraine had 1 or 2 months ago, that is to say when this war began, is either no longer functioning for reasons like a general lack of fuel, a lack of ammunition, a lack of other kinds of necessary infrastructure, or said equipment is just outright destroyed. So the point here is that if the West should ever start overextending itself in the process of shipping arms to Ukraine, and all of those arms still do not change the military situation on the ground, that is to say, all of them are destroyed before they can make any significant difference, then that is just going to weaken the military situation of the collective West even further, which would translate to a net victory for Russia and in turn a net victory for the global East. A guess on my part would be that perhaps this is the reason for why Russia still hasn't taken to destroying the railroad infrastructure of Ukraine. There is, of course, no way to corroborate this, but perhaps, just maybe, Russia is actually counting on Western countries to send more and more arms into Ukraine, especially heavy equipment, which, unlike something like an RPG or a Stinger missile, cannot be simply smuggled into the country, and cannot be hidden away in some random warehouse, thereby making its destruction via air power or via artillery inevitable. Maybe Russia is actually counting on the collective West shipping so many arms to Ukraine and having all of that equipment be individually destroyed in such large numbers that the military-industrial complexes of the West simply won't be able to crack up production numbers to make up the difference. Given how much Ukrainian equipment we're seeing being destroyed via UAVs, via airstrikes from ground attack aircraft, via artillery strikes, especially in recent days, one has to wonder if this might actually be part of Russia's overall strategy. And I would note here that irrespective of how much equipment the West sends to Ukraine, it is never going to be able to stand up against the Russian military. Unless, of course, we are talking about a guerrilla war, of which we have seen absolutely no traces in any part of Ukraine thus far. But when it comes to an open battle, the West sending equipment, especially heavy equipment, will make almost no difference. And the reason for this is that heavy equipment like tanks, artillery, aircraft are all created and designed to function as a part of a greater whole. That is to say, a part of a well-supplied and a well-trained military. A Ukrainian soldier who has no experience of operating a Western-designed tank and has no way of preventing that tank from simply being destroyed from the air is simply not going to make any difference in the war. And here I have to note that the vast majority of equipment that has been sent to Ukraine is actually Soviet equipment, and that is for exactly this reason, since it is the only equipment that Ukrainian soldiers by and large are trained to use. And of course, Soviet equipment is not very advanced by modern standards, nor is there that much of it in the first place, since most of it has been out of action for some time, and there are no more Soviet factories to produce more of them. Though perhaps the even more damning part of this plan is that soon there won't be enough trained personnel to operate any kind of equipment. Training a soldier to fight, to follow orders, and to use any kinds of weapon system always takes time. And at the current pace, Ukraine simply won't have enough soldiers, except for perhaps a few brigades of absolutely green cadets, to operate any of the equipment that they are being supplied with. Now, all of that is not to say that Western arms shipments aren't helping Ukraine. Of course they are. Having more weapons to fight with in the middle of a war is never a bad thing. Nor is intelligence, nor are supplies. So the Western effort to help Ukraine's military is not going to complete waste. However, the longer that this war goes on, the more hollowed out Ukraine's military becomes. The more this campaign to supply Ukraine with weapons is going to face diminishing returns. And eventually, I think that we will reach a point where all of these weapon systems either make absolutely no difference as to what is happening on the ground, or make such a minuscule difference that it is perhaps simply not worth the effort. Since we also have to remember that the more of this equipment falls into Russia's hands, the better the Russians will be able to construct a picture of what this equipment is capable of, the more of its exact technical specifications they will know, and potentially they will even be able to supply it to their own forces and to reverse engineer some of its parts for their own military industry. So, in conclusion, we are in the middle of a geopolitical battle. A battle that is taking place in Ukraine in the form of a hot war between Russia and Ukraine. This war, no matter how one spins it, is absolutely unwinnable for Ukraine. Ukraine cannot defeat the Russian military in any conventional sense. That is to say that Ukraine lost this geopolitical battle on February 24th. However, the collective West, which de facto controls Ukraine and uses Ukraine to its own geopolitical ends, does have a chance at winning. If the Ukrainian military can fight well enough and fight hard enough, and if it is supplied with enough weapon systems by the West to inflict considerable casualties on Russia, and perhaps bog down Russia in Ukraine for several years to come, forcing it to fight various local militants, then the collective West could score an overall win. However, if this conflict does not result in very high military casualties for Russia, and does not inflict lasting damage on the Russian economy, then we are going to start seeing a situation where not only the Ukrainian military is hollowed out, but the militaries of other countries of the collective West are also hollowed out during this campaign to send equipment to Ukraine. Then we will inevitably see Russia's military position growing stronger. And it would not just grow stronger in relative terms, it could potentially grow stronger in absolute terms as well, since at that point you would have many divisions of the Russian armed forces that are battle-hardened and experienced as a result of the war in Ukraine. Not to mention the fact that Russia's military command will learn from any and all mistakes made in Ukraine. And make no mistake about this, I'm not saying that Russia has committed a bunch of horrible mistakes. Mistakes happen in every military operation. It is an unavoidable fact of war that when you have your own plans, and your enemy is always trying to thwart those plans, something is always going to go wrong. However, the mistakes of every war are an opportunity for commanders to learn and to avoid making those mistakes in the future, as well as to see any potential flaws in their weapon systems or military doctrines. So if this war doesn't go horribly for Russia in the future, if we don't see Russian casualties in the tens and hundreds of thousands, then, just like the Syrian conflict, this war will begin to strengthen the Russian military even before Ukraine is secured under Russia's control. That is to say, even before Ukraine's military industry is joined with Russia's military industry, even before shipbuilding facilities at Nikolaev, tank construction bureaus in Kharkov, aircraft construction bureaus like Antonov, are all joined with Russia's military-industrial complex after the post-Maidan government in Ukraine is changed. Whether that is what will happen, we will have to wait and see. I have to say here, once again, that this war will at the very least last for several more months. It is not inconceivable to see this war going into the next year even. And unlike the ridiculous narrative that Ukraine is winning the hot war on the ground and that the Ukrainian military is beating the Russian military in open battle, in this particular situation, that is to say, on the global geopolitical scale, it is not at all inconceivable for the West to win. And again, whether that is indeed what will happen, we will just have to wait and see. And that really is all that I have to say on this matter, at least for now. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave a like. It helps the algorithm. And also, please be sure to check out my Telegram channel. the link to which will be in the video description, as well as for my Rumble channel.